I'm David Westin from Bloomberg News, and we're delighted now to welcome General David Petraeus. He, of course, is a former head of the CIA, as well as former head of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq. He is now a partner at KKR. So, General, thank you so much for joining us today. The subject is the new security paradigm. We've heard a lot about security in recent days involving Europe, from the G7 to NATO to the Putin summit with President Biden. But the one thing that was not in the room was China, which may be, in fact, the largest issue in the security paradigm. Give us a sense of how important China is right now for the United States and that globally when it comes to security.
Well, thanks, David. Great to be with you and great to be with this event. Look, the most important relationship in the world by far is that between the U.S. and China. And it's not just for our two countries, it is for the rest of the world as well. And with respect, China was not in the room, if you will, during the G7 and the EU and the NATO summits, but it got mentioned in each of those communiques. So clearly China is on the mind of everyone. Everyone wants to see the US-China relationship, and indeed the relationships of other countries and blocs with China, be as mutually beneficial as is absolutely possible. But obviously, there have been cases of quite considerable competition, indeed, to a degree, confrontation. And in fact, the individual who oversees the Indo-Pacific region, as it's described now for the White House, recently said that the era of engagement is over and the era of competition has arrived to characterize the US-China relationship. My sense is that the new US administration is putting together, first of all, getting its own house in order, combating the pandemic, getting the economy going again, bringing the country together, then reaching out to all of our allies and partners and friends around the world, make sure they're all on side to reassert, renew U.S. leadership and the value that the U.S. places on alliances, on partnerships, and on allies, and then to craft a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end, all the capabilities, not just of the US, but of our partners and allies as well, to try to influence China, in particular, to avoid real confrontation, and ideally to influence decision-making in Beijing on certain issues involving trade and economic interaction, how each country interacts with the world, with international organizations and so forth and so on. And I think, frankly, the administration is off to a good start. And by the way, I am a true non-political person in the United States and advise members of either political party and served in two senior positions, each for a Republican president and a Democratic president.
General, when you talk about competition, I think of economic and military, and they necessarily overlap, but there is some difference between them. How would you assess the relative importance of the economic competition as opposed to some of the military issues?
Well, I think it's huge because, again, it's your economic power, if you will, that is the foundation of your national power. It's what enables you to raise and support an Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, space, and so forth. It's what gives you, again, the influence in many different quarters around the world. And so, again, I think rightly, the new administration has said foreign policy truly does begin at home in this case, especially given the challenges of the pandemic. The U.S. is well on the way to cornering it, if you will, and driving way down the number of cases and so forth with an aggressive vaccination campaign, equally aggressive fiscal support for economic revival. You can see, I think, the economy roaring back. In fact, now the concern is inflation rather than, inadequate growth. And then it's about, of course, just the sense that the country is together. If you have all of that, you have a very strong foundation upon which to build and to project your activities around the world. But let's make no mistake about it. The reason the U.S. can spend in recent years $740 billion on defense is because of that economic strength, the revenues that come from that, and also the capabilities that are derived from an advanced economy when it comes to the cutting edge tools and implements for defense policy and forces.
General Petraeus, President Trump certainly had a lot of policies, particularly on the economic sphere with respect to China. There now is a review going on for a lot of those policies by the Biden administration. Give us a sense of where you think the Biden administration should be heading, and particularly, if I could ask, how much of this is national security related when it comes to trade? Because there's some trade that perhaps has little direct effect on national security. There's some that we've seen, particularly in the technology area, that has a lot.
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that the Trump administration very much changed the conversation when it came to China. And I think by and large, that change reflected a bipartisan consensus in Washington and indeed throughout the country that perhaps the US had not been firm enough in the past with China. And it appears that the new administration, someone recently characterized the approach as to remain firm or hard, but do it with allies and partners. And I think that's, that's a reasonable characterization. Certainly, all of the eaches are being re-examined. Do all the tariffs need to stay in place? Do the entities list, which in many cases are key to items related to national security, to ensure, for example, that very sensitive technologies are not being sold overseas that can then be used in adversarial military forces and so forth. So there's a lot of that that is being re-examined right now. I mean, the most celebrated issue also has to do with 5G, as you know, and concerns about whether if you have a Chinese 5G company that would enable some kind of intelligence gathering. All these issues are being re-examined, I think appropriately, by a new administration. But my sense is that many of the initiatives of the previous administration will stay in place, albeit with a greater degree of what might be termed coherence and comprehensiveness.
General Petraeus, at the G7, we heard about China. As you say, they weren't in the room, but boy, they were talked about. And one way we heard about it was a possible counter to the so-called One Belt, One Road that President Biden seems to be really pursuing with respect to infrastructure. What would you advise when you talk about really building our relations with our allies with respect to China? What would you advise about a counter to One Belt, One Road? And by the way, should we go back to that Trans-Pacific Partnership?
I'd love to see us go back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm a big proponent of trade. I argued publicly for that. Ironically, of course, Vice President Biden for 8 years promoted the Trans-Pacific Partnership only to discover some shortcomings. And of course, it's really a domestic political issue at the end of the day. And I don't think that we'll see the US coming back to that in the first 2 years of this administration. We'll see what happens in the midterm elections. If they're feeling, again, that they have a solid foundation, then you may see a return to what was then called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and had much more importance in geostrategic terms, frankly, than it did in, say, economic terms for the US in particular. But again, something that was very, very important. And as you look at, again, this competition with China, what, again, we need to see is all of the countries coming together. And one of those facets, and I have also supported this publicly, is at least we ought to be in the arena competing, providing an alternative to countries when they are trying to carry out their own infrastructure development initiatives, and an alternative to the Belt and Road initiative. So that funding, there should be a competition, there should be a corollary. And in fact, if you put together the International Development Finance Corporation money, which was doubled by the Trump administration, the assets of that, our AID budget, the development budget, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, then you bring in the UK's DFID and Japan Development Agency. If you gather all of the partners and allies together, then you have, I think, quite a good, healthy competition. And again, all we can ever ask is to be able to compete. And I think that would be healthy for the countries that are pursuing these infrastructure initiatives. I think it will be healthy actually for what China is doing. And let's be fair that China has been examining its experiences with the Belt and Road Initiative. And it has actually been making changes to how it goes about what it does in response to what have, I think, in some cases been legitimate criticisms or lessons learned. So I applaud the initiative that was announced in this regard, and I hope we will see it come to fruition, and that Samantha Power, the very energetic USAID director, and others can propel this forward, and again provide an alternative, a competitive alternative to what China has sought to do, which again they should welcome as just as we do, I think.